In 1936, a major European power systematically unleashed chemical weapons on tens of thousands of African civilians, burning them alive from the inside out. Hospitals and Red Cross ambulances were bombed to make sure the wounded couldn't get help. This wasn't some dark secret, it was a state-sanctioned genocide, approved at the highest levels of government. You've never heard this story because it was buried for 90 years. Italian aircraft appeared over Ethiopian villages at dawn, releasing yellow clouds that drifted down like deadly rain. The cattle collapsed first, foaming at the mouth. Then the children started coughing blood. Survivors, interviewed decades later, recalled the horror. We thought it was fog from the mountains, but when the animals began foaming at the mouth, we knew something terrible had come. Over 18 months, Italian forces conducted over 60 documented chemical attacks across Ethiopia. They poisoned ancient wells, contaminated entire valleys, and turned the air itself into a weapon of mass destruction. This is the story of the most documented chemical warfare campaign of the 20th century, and how its cover-up created the blueprint for every atrocity that followed. This is how Ethiopia stood alone against fascist terror, saved the evidence, and ultimately survived to expose the truth, even when the world's most powerful nations conspired to bury it forever. To understand the savagery that followed, we need to rewind 4 decades to 1896. As European powers carved up Africa in the scramble for Africa, the Kingdom of Italy faced a military disaster that would scar its national pride for a generation. At the Battle of Adwa, a modern Italian army was decisively crushed by Ethiopian Emperor Menelik II. Over 7,000 Italian soldiers died in a single day. It was an unheard-of victory for an African nation and a deep humiliation for Italy that the country never forgot. Fast forward to 1922. Benito Mussolini and his fascist party were in power. He made one thing clear: Ethiopia would pay for that defeat. This wasn't just about empire, it was personal revenge against the only African nation that had successfully resisted European domination. It was personal, it was unfinished business. Ethiopian intelligence networks that had served Menelik II watched Italian military build-up throughout the early 1930s. Ethiopian diplomats traveled to European capitals, warning of Italian preparations for invasion. They presented evidence to the League of Nations, hoping international law might protect them. Ethiopian leaders understood Italian intentions, but believed the post-World War I international order would prevent another European war of conquest. They were catastrophically wrong. On October 3, 1935, without declaring war, Mussolini's armies invaded from 2 directions. General Emilio de Bono attacked from Eritrea in the north. General Rodolfo Graziani advanced from Italian Somaliland in the south. Over 400,000 Italian and colonial troops would eventually pour into Ethiopia, supported by 600 aircraft, hundreds of tanks, and modern artillery. Emperor Haile Selassie's army, though incredibly brave, was outgunned. His soldiers were mostly armed with old rifles and traditional weapons. The entire Ethiopian Air Force had fewer than 15 planes. The technological gap was staggering, but Ethiopian commanders like Ras Mulugeta and Ras Kassa had learned from Adwa. They developed guerrilla tactics that frustrated Italian advances. Ethiopian forces knew every mountain pass, every seasonal water source, every cave system. They would strike Italian supply lines and vanish into terrain no European army could navigate. Ethiopian resistance was so effective that by December 1935, the Italian offensive had stalled completely. Frustrated and impatient for quick, crushing victory, Mussolini made a decision that would define this conflict. In encrypted telegrams to his commanders, he authorized the use of all available means to achieve victory. Italian military archives, declassified in the 1990s, reveal exactly what this meant. On December 15, 1935, the first shipment arrived at Massawa port, 350 tons of mustard gas in artillery shells and aerial spray tanks. Italy was about to test whether the world really meant what it had signed in the 1925 Geneva Protocol banning chemical weapons. What you're witnessing is just the beginning of one of history's most shocking war crimes. If stories like this, the untold truths of African resistance and colonial brutality, matter to you, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. Because what happens next will show you exactly why powerful nations still get away with targeting civilians today. With Mussolini's direct blessing, the first chemical attack came on December 23, 1935, over the Takazi Valley. Italian engineers had fitted their aircraft with special spraying equipment, allowing them to poison 20 square kilometers in a single flight. What Haile Selassie would later call a fine, death-dealing rain. Mustard gas is a nightmare weapon. It burns the skin, eyes, and lungs, causing horrific blisters and blindness. For Ethiopian soldiers who often fought barefoot or in sandals, the effect was catastrophic. But this chemical war wasn't confined to battlefields. Italian specialists studied Ethiopian hydrology, mapping seasonal water flows and identifying wells that served multiple communities. These became primary targets. The strategy was calculated: contaminate the resources that communities depended on, force entire populations to abandon their ancestral lands, and break the will of the people. On March 4, 1936, Italian aircraft attacked the town of Quoram on Market Day, when thousands of people gathered to trade. The planes, flying in formation, released yellow clouds over the crowded marketplace. People ran in all directions as the yellow poison followed them. Children collapsed first, then women carrying babies. By evening, over 1,700 people were dead. But the Italians went further. In flagrant violation of the Geneva Conventions, Italian pilots were ordered to attack Red Cross ambulances and field hospitals. The goal was to make escape or medical aid nearly impossible. Dr. Marcel Junod of the International Red Cross arrived in February 1936 and documented what he found. Patients presented severe burns across their entire bodies. Eyes were swollen completely shut, skin covered with blisters and ulcers. Many died within hours of respiratory failure. The scale of the horror was unprecedented. Meanwhile, the international community that claimed to stand for justice was about to reveal its true face. This is only half the story. What you've seen is horrifying. But what comes next will show you how Ethiopians fought back against impossible odds, how they preserved the truth when the world tried to bury it, and why this 90-year-old cover-up still shapes how civilians are targeted today. By March 1936, Italian aircraft were systematically gassing Ethiopian civilians. Over 1,700 people died in a single market day attack. 30% of all Ethiopian war casualties came from banned chemical weapons. But this is where most documentaries would end, with Ethiopians as helpless victims of European brutality. That's not what happened. Ethiopian communities developed survival strategies that saved thousands of lives. They preserved evidence when the world tried to destroy it, and their fight for justice reveals a truth about international law that still shapes conflicts today. This is part 2, the cover-up. While Italian commanders expected terror to break Ethiopian resolve, communities adapted with strategies that completely surprised their attackers. Local commanders developed early warning networks using traditional horn signals that could carry across mountain valleys. Communities learned to recognize the distinct sound of Italian spray aircraft from ordinary fighters. Ethiopian women played crucial roles as intelligence gatherers, identifying natural caves and rock formations that provided protection during attacks. They learned to recognize contaminated water sources by watching animal behavior. If birds wouldn't drink from a stream, neither should humans. Ethiopian healers developed treatments for chemical burns using traditional medicines combined with knowledge from the few trained Ethiopian medical personnel. Ras Imru's northern army began targeting Italian supply depots where chemical weapons were stored, forcing the Italians to divert troops to guard poison gas stockpiles. Ethiopian forces conducted successful raids on Italian positions even after surviving multiple chemical attacks. But the most important resistance was intellectual. Ethiopian leaders understood they were fighting not just for military victory, but for historical truth. When diplomatic appeals failed, Ethiopian representatives methodically gathered evidence. They photographed victims, collected witness testimonies, documented attack dates and locations, and preserved contaminated soil samples. Ethiopian intellectual Tekle Hawariat, who served in the resistance, would later write, "We knew the world was not listening to our pleas for help. But we also knew that someday history would demand an accounting. We made sure the evidence would survive, even if we did not. This documentation would prove crucial when Ethiopia later sought justice. But first, they had to survive the world's betrayal. So where was the international community while all this was happening? Ethiopia had been a League of Nations member since 1923 and pleaded desperately for intervention. The League did condemn Italy's invasion and voted for economic sanctions. The problem was, the sanctions were a joke. They were weak, implemented too slowly, and most importantly, didn't ban the sale of crucial war materials like oil, steel, or coal. This wasn't incompetence. It was a calculated betrayal. The big powers, especially Britain and France, were playing a cynical political chess game. They were terrified of rising Nazi Germany and wanted to keep Mussolini on their side, to stop him from joining forces with Hitler. The secret Hoare-Laval Pact revealed their true intentions. They planned to gift 2/3 of Ethiopia to Italy to keep Mussolini satisfied. They were willing to throw Ethiopia under the bus to maintain fragile peace in Europe. The plan fell apart after public outrage, but the message to Mussolini was clear. Nobody was going to seriously try to stop him. Meanwhile, the United States, not even in the League, actually increased exports to Italy. American oil companies fueled the very aircraft dropping poison gas over Ethiopian villages. On June 30, 1936, Emperor Haile Selassie made a final desperate appeal to the League of Nations in Geneva. Standing before delegates who had already decided his nation's fate, he delivered a prophetic warning. "It is us today. It will be you tomorrow." Selassie asked the League, "God and history will remember your judgment. What reply shall I have to take back to my people?" The Ethiopian delegation presented overwhelming evidence: photographs of gas attack victims, medical reports from European doctors, intercepted Italian military communications, testimony from Red Cross personnel. European newspapers dismissed Ethiopian claims as unverified, despite abundant documentation. The League abandoned Ethiopia completely. By May 1936, Italian troops marched into Addis Ababa, and Mussolini proudly declared a new Italian empire from his balcony in Rome. The war had left hundreds of thousands of Ethiopians dead, a huge number from chemical weapons. But the horror wasn't over. On February 19, 1937, after a failed assassination attempt on Italian Viceroy Rodolfo Graziani, Italian forces unleashed the Yekatit 12 massacre. 19,000 to 30,000 Ethiopians were murdered in Addis Ababa alone over 3 days. Governor-General Rodolfo Graziani maintained stockpiles of chemical weapons throughout the occupation, issuing public warnings that any resistance would meet the same fate as the rebels of 1936. When British forces finally helped liberate Ethiopia in 1941, Haile Selassie returned carrying 6 years of meticulously documented evidence against Italian war criminals. Now came the test. Would the world finally deliver justice? Ethiopian efforts to achieve justice revealed the depth of international hypocrisy. Haile Selassie submitted formal charges to the United Nations War Crimes Commission, demanding prosecution of Italian officers who had used chemical weapons. The evidence was overwhelming: witness testimony, medical documentation, captured military orders, photographic proof. Yet not a single Italian officer faced trial for crimes committed. They pushed for extradition of officials who ordered gas attacks, like Marshal Pietro Badoglio, but the Allies blocked them. The reason was brutally simple: Italy had switched sides near the war's end and was now seen as a key ally against communism in Europe. Prosecuting Italian officials was politically inconvenient. Cold War politics trumped justice. Military archives remained classified. Academic histories minimized chemical warfare. The story disappeared from international consciousness, but Ethiopian historians, oral tradition keepers, and diaspora communities refused to let the truth die. In Ethiopian highlands, where Italian aircraft once dropped mustard gas, children play in fields their great-grandparents fled in terror. The land has healed, the memory has not. The Italians called it pacification, the League called it regrettable, the world called it forgotten. But Ethiopians never forgot. Their testimony stands as proof that truth survives, even when the powerful try to bury it. But here's what I learned making this series. The world hasn't changed as much as we like to think. The same calculations that abandoned Ethiopia in 1936 still decide which victims matter today. And if you want more untold stories of African resistance, colonial brutality, and the truth that mainstream history won't touch,
an attack against Graziani by the Ethiopian resistance on February 19, 1937, the Italian military command ordered a mass extermination, 14,294 rebels killed and executed and 50,000 houses burned, culminating in the massacre of the Coptic monks of Debri Libanos and carried out by units led by Pietro Maletti. Decades later, the latter's son, Giant Adelio Maletti, who followed in his father's footsteps in his military career, was convicted of aiding and abetting as part of the investigation into the December 12, 1969 Piazza Fontana massacre. Giorgia Meloni could learn in Ethiopia the story of another of the founding fathers of her MSI, Alessandro Lissona, placed by Mussolini at the head of the Ministry for Italian East Africa. In the post-war period, having gone through the purge unscathed, he would be a member and then senator of the MSI in 1963. April 1969, he resigned from the party and joined the National Front of Junio Valerio Borghese, another honorary president of the MSI, shortly before the coup attempt of December 7 to 8, 1970. Thus, while she's touting a chimerical Mattei plan for Africa, Meloni might take the opportunity to think back to those founding fathers and those people who are no more to whom she dedicated her electoral victory in September. Instead, she will continue to ignore the issue, and so will national public opinion, banking on the country's disinterest in knowledge of its past and relying on the sad spirit of our times, which recalls Karl Kraus' famous aphorism, when the sun of culture is low, even dwarves will cast long shadows.
Moi, je crois que Mussolini, c'était un bon politicien. C'est-à-dire que tout ce qu'il a fait pour l'Italie.
Presidente.
Considero positivo, come sapete, che ci sia un accordo, ma se non lo non vado nei dettagli non sono in grado di giudicare il merito.
Buonasera.
Si conclude un vertice importante, tanto chiaramente per gli impegni. Un messaggio molto importante, mi pare di avervi detto tutto.
Non c'era stata la reazione di Trump.
Non mi pare che risolviamo grandi problemi.
Presidente, scusi, con il Presidente Trump è riuscito a parlare ieri sera anche del tema dazi?
Si chiude al 10% i dazi. Tajani ha detto che va bene così, lei è d'accordo?
Impegnatissima per ottenere questo risultato.
Aumenti sostenibili, ha detto l'Italia permetterà comunque di circa 100 miliardi in 10 anni, così è il calcolo tra sicurezza e difesa.
Lei che mandare Presidente
Per rafforzare la colonna europea.
Sì.
Jumping on my dick, I know she like it 'cause you know